Good morning, everyone. We are going to get this session started. We're a few minutes behind. Bear with us this morning. One of our speakers couldn't join us because of the storm, so we have him on Zoom. And we're actually going to take this opportunity to record it since we are on Zoom. So don't anybody say anything they don't want a recording. But actually, he can only hear through the microphone. So when it does become time for questions, if you'll come up to the mics if you do have a question. So once again, good morning and welcome to our morning general session. Lynetta Greiner was actually going to be the moderator for this session. Lynetta Greiner of Usher Land and Timber. She is very passionate about this topic and was very sad she couldn't be here to be the moderator. So I am here in her place. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brittany Varn. I'm with the Florida Forestry Association. I'm the Director of Forestry and Regulatory Affairs for the association. So I will be your moderator this session. Our first speakers, so we have actually two sessions in this general session. And our first speakers both do important work for issues that, like I said, Lynetta is very passionate about, and I'm excited to learn about climate smart agriculture and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. One of our speakers is Ernie Shae. He is the president of Solutions from the Land, a not-for-profit organization that promotes farmer-inspired solutions to global changes. The group aims to help Florida ag and forestry leaders examine the vulnerabilities and opportunities created by climate change. And Ernie is the one joining us through Zoom this morning. So you will see him up in a little bit on the screen. We also have Tom Hoctor, directs the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at the University of Florida, an expert on GIS applications for identifying conservation policies and priorities to help protect and manage ecosystem services. Tom is focused on the wildlife corridor potential to re-energize conservation land protection in Florida. So please help me welcome Mr. Tom Hoctor. He's going to come up and then Ernie will follow his presentation.
Good morning. I'm happy to see you, especially under the circumstances. I have my own Hurricane Idalia story, and that is, I wanted to speak to you this morning to the extent that I drove all the way from Maine to be here. So I'm originally from Maine, and because I'm on a 9-month appointment, I go to Maine for a little bit every summer. I usually come back about this time. So it's a long drive, but the idea was instead of going back to Gainesville this time, that I was going to drive straight here. And of course, it became really interesting in terms of whether the conference was going to happen or not, and whether I should drive to Gainesville or here. But as the forecast continued to develop the way it did, it seemed to make more sense to come here and speak to you all this morning. I was born in Maine, but I've been in Florida since 1968. My parents went to the University of Maine, decided to take teaching jobs at Titusville High School on the Space Coast, because it was in the middle of the Apollo era, so Titusville was booming. And I've been here ever since, except my 4 years as an undergraduate. I got both my master's and PhD at the University of Florida. And I've been working on landscape scale, GIS-based conservation planning and policy since at least 1996, when I started as a full-time research scientist after I passed my qualifying exam that same year. I'm going to cover a lot of ground today. Not going to go over all the details. I don't have time for that. But as is always the case when I speak, I'm going to have to gloss over some details. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody after this talk if you are interested in any kind of follow-up, including follow-up questions that if we don't have time to address that in the question and answer session today. I'm going to talk about the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the Florida 2040-2070 project. These are all things that are being worked on right now, but some of those projects have been going on for 25 years now. And also talk a little bit about, as a segue to Ernie, the work that we're doing with the Florida Climate Smart Agriculture Working Group as part of our Florida 2040-2070 project. So I hope all of you or most of you have heard of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. I'm sure almost everybody's heard of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The Florida Wildlife Corridor has made the news in the last 2.5 years because it became a state law. That our legislature and governor agreed that there was this thing in the state called the Florida Wildlife Corridor that was worthy of protection efforts to try to conserve, working with, of course, willing landowners in a voluntary fashion with incentives, easements, and other programs. It's important to know that Florida has been embarked on a greenways program since the late 1990s. I'm not going to go over detail on this slide, but the point is the Florida Wildlife Corridor really isn't new. It's a new name for an older project, the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which was born in 1997 in a cooperative project between the University of Florida, and I was the director of efforts to develop the first Ecological Greenways Network, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, working with many science and other partners to figure out what data would be used in what way to identify this statewide network. And that network is intended, this is not a plan per se. Even though the state has a Greenways plan, that's part of state law, the first Greenways program law passed in 1997, it is really a data layer, GIS data layer, intended to inform planning, especially conservation planning for programs like Florida Forever, to make sure that we are including lands of landscape scale significance that are important to combat habitat fragmentation, protect species that have large home ranges, protect water resources, and other ecosystem services. This data layer has existed, like I said, since 97. So it's been helping to guide the Florida Forever program, the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, and other conservation planning efforts, including federal programs like NRCS easement programs for many years. The Florida Ecological Greenways Network was updated in 2021. It, in fact, has 5 priority levels. And I apologize for having to look at my slides, but I have to remember what the colors are. The dark blues, you see dark green on this map, those are existing conservation lands, both public lands and private conservation easements. Then the blues, the dark blues that you see and the lighter blue that you see, which are kind of running together in this color scheme, are the highest priorities. And then that bright green is what's called priority 3. So collectively, that's priority 1, 2, and 3. Again, this is just a map that's used to guide conservation planning. There are no regulations or anything like that tied to this map. In the last 10 years, a group of people, including Carlton Ward, a photographer who's been working in Florida for many years and comes from an old Florida ranching family, thought that maybe the Florida Ecological Greenways Network wasn't the greatest name in the world. And that maybe that we should organize a public outreach and education campaign under a different name to help popularize the concept or get people to learn about the concept of a ecological greenways network. He coined the term Florida Wildlife Corridor, working with me, and that existed as a non-state program, in other words, an NGO pushing this. You may have seen one of the Florida Wildlife Corridor films, but this became state law in 2 years ago. And it is the top 3 priorities in the Ecological Greenways Network. So think the Ecological Greenways Network is 5 priority levels. The law says the Florida Wildlife Corridor is priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 in the Ecological Greenways Network. If you've looked at that law, all it talks about is there's a lot of aspirational language about payments for ecosystem services and other incentives-based or voluntary measures to help protect the corridor. I'm not going to go over this chart except look at the 3 red numbers. If you add all that up, that's all the unprotected land in the Florida Wildlife Corridor. There are about 8 million acres of unprotected land. That means it is not state conservation land. It is not protected as an easement if it's private land. It's private land that doesn't have its development rights encumbered by an agreement. So that's a lot of land, right? Trying to protect 8 million acres of a fast-growing state is a tall order. So one of the things that we're working on at the center at the University of Florida is working with our partner, Florida Natural Areas Inventory to do strategic prioritization. You have 8 million acres. What areas are most important for closing gaps and corridors of that 8 million acres? And I'm going to go through this next section very quickly, but I'm going to show you some of the data layers that we've been working on over the last 2 years to help us do that strategic prioritization. One is the so-called Florida Fragmentation Index, a product from the center. Those dark green areas, you probably notice that a lot of those dark green areas in the north half of the state are timberlands, right? We're talking about intact, natural, semi-natural lands across the state. And if it is a larger intact area, it's most important for accomplishing the goals of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We also create models where we're trying to prioritize areas that are closer to existing conservation lands because it makes sense to build out from existing conservation lands to close these gaps. If you don't protect an entire corridor, at least you've enlarged an existing conservation land, in some cases made partial connections across the state. Another thing that we're obviously concerned about is when we talk about implementation is parcel size. Small parcels are very hard to protect, right? You're dealing with lots of smaller landowners. If we can protect primary corridors working with larger parcels, that's where we want to work because it is more cost and time efficient. We're also worried about bottlenecks, places that are narrow parts of the corridor or have potential conflicts like growth nearby or types of land uses that aren't as compatible as forestry or ranch lands are for protecting a corridor. All those pink areas that you see in the map are what we have identified as bottlenecks. Next step for prioritization, it includes thinking about species that need large connected landscapes. So we're working together to identify strategic conservation priorities for a set of focal species, including Florida black bear, Florida panther, many others. Obviously, there's lots of roads that cross the corridor, right? We have a lot of highways in the state of Florida. We're working with an expert from the University of Central Florida to identify the locations where, working with FDOT, we might build underpasses in the future for wildlife to reduce road kills and to increase connectivity. We also are working to update a project called the Critical Lands and Waters Identification Project, which is core data layers that we use to strategically prioritize the corridor. And we need to update those layers since the last time they were done is in 2016. And I'll talk about the last one here in a minute. So timberlands and ranchlands make up most of the corridor. About 80% of the unprotected land in the Florida Wildlife Corridor are timberlands or ranchlands. And the color scheme that you see here, ranchlands in yellow and brown are timberlands, silvicultural lands. And we have this very interesting dichotomy, right? The southern half of the state dominated by working lands are mainly ranch. There is some forestry land in there, some timber management going on. And the northern half of the state is all primarily timber. It makes the point that these land uses are essential for protecting the corridor. And they're essential in their current state as ranch lands or timberlands. This isn't a preservation plan. It isn't necessarily restore natural communities to some form or condition plan. These lands have been identified as important as part of a statewide conservation network based on current use. This brings home that point is it's showing you 3 types of agriculture in the state. This is part of our Florida 2070 project done for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which I'll talk about next. And the point is that all of those ranch lands, timberlands, and other types of agriculture are important for protecting our biodiversity as is. These lands are also extremely important for resiliency from at least 3 perspectives. We saw that yesterday, right? You see the pink areas on this map. These are areas where we still have a really good chance to allow species and natural systems to respond to sea level rise, that there's an opportunity to allow migration inland or retreat inland to allow species to migrate as the coastline moves as well. The green are areas that are important for corridors that are important for resiliency. I think the orange areas are watersheds that are important for helping keep resilient coastal ecosystems because they're providing functional fresh water to help resist sea level rise. So that brings us to the last part of this presentation, We're working with a number of partners and specifically the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to identify future development trends in Florida and compare them to current agricultural land uses to get an idea of what lands are most likely to be lost to development in the near term and what might we do about it? What are the recommendations to lead Florida's agriculture community, including timberlands, to a resilient, sustainable future? Number of assessments, I'll just touch on some of these today. This includes an effort to identify lands that are potentially most suitable for development. And I'm going to skip over the details of this model. This report, the first version of this report, became available this past spring. This is being done in partnership with both FDACS and 1,000 Friends of Florida. It's a classic real estate model where we project potential development based on the kinds of things that usually attract new development. We're also using projections for future human population growth using the numbers provided by Bieber, which is a UF bureau that has been doing county level population projections for many years, and using that to identify potential future development in two scenarios: a trend, which assumes things continue the same way they are today, including lower density future development, meaning sprawl, and then an alternate scenario where you are more proactive. You try to accommodate new development that is more dense. So therefore it takes up less land to accommodate the same amount of people. So in this 2040 scenario, so we did both a 2040 and 2070 scenario. And this is the projected development. One of the things that you'll see in these maps is red can mean both existing or potential future development. And you're talking about quite a bit of development by 2040. But that's not very far away. So we did a 2040 projection to help us figure out nearer term potential future development as the primary, if we're going to rate lands as significant because they're important for conservation, but they're likely to be lost to development in a nearer term, i.e. by 2040, that those are higher priorities for protection if we think we can protect them before development pressure finds them. Then 2070, you see a lot more red. Approximately 3.4 million acres of potential new development. A lot of that on ranch lands in South Florida, southern half of the peninsula, but quite a bit on timberlands as well. This map is not as explicit as it should be, but all of those reddish or orange areas are areas that are currently timberlands that potentially would be developed by 2070. And that represents approximately or over 800,000 acres of land that is currently in forestry operation that could be lost to development in the next 50 years or so. Now remember, these are just projections. We don't like to call them predictions. We frequently use the term future scenario, where you make a number of assumptions, you make those assumptions explicit, but you're making assumptions. And one of the assumptions we had to make is, how do people respond to sea level rise? So one of the things I skipped over on an earlier slide is the fact that we did use data from published literature, especially from Matt Hauer at Florida State University, to predict how many people might have to move in Florida because of a 0.9 meter sea level rise, which is likely to happen between now and 2070. We projected that half those people, based on Matt's paper, that about half those people would move out of state. The other half would stay in state. We also didn't predict those people moving or project those people moving very far. But one of the things that's unknown is how far inland are people willing to move to get out of harm's way. So we may be underrepresenting the development pressure in places like Okeechobee County, which isn't showing up as being very developed in a 2070 future. Maybe we're grossly lower predicting that than is what really is going to happen. But that could be true for North Florida. This is not based on data. This is just a graphic. All those lines are trying to represent people are going to have to move away from the coast. Where are they going to go? And are they going to go much further inland? So one of the things that we do in terms of opportunities, the state has a lot of land for a lot of money currently Florida Wildlife Corridors help with this, but we have land, money to protect land through the Florida Forever and the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. There are also federal programs like Forest Legacy, which are important for providing additional conservation dollars for easements in Florida. One of the things that we do at the University of Florida Center for Landscape Conservation Planning is identify lands that are potentially most suitable for various federal easement programs. So this is our Forest Legacy map, where the dark blues are the highest priorities. And then we take all of the federal and state easement programs and create a cumulative map for the state. This is new data that was just produced this spring that we're going to use with NRCS and other partners to help them make better strategic decisions about where they should do easements that have value for protecting large landscapes, water resources, et cetera. So next steps. We're going to continue to work on strategic prioritization of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That's an ongoing effort with Florida Natural Areas Inventory and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Ernie's going to talk about the Florida Climate Smart Agriculture Work Group today, trying to identify or work to protect a sustainable, resilient future for agriculture. We're contracted with the Florida Climate Smart Agriculture Group to help us develop a set of recommendations and also to provide outreach and dissemination. All of these maps I showed you today, the goal is to share them with all agricultural operators across the state, so they know what this information is, why it was produced, why it potentially matters to them, and what do you think about it? And what do you think about the future of your agricultural operations in the state? What do we do about it? How do we make sure we have a healthy forest industry 50 years from now, or ranching, or other types of agriculture? That's the work that the Florida Climate Smart Agriculture Work Group is doing. And they're going to help us develop a set of recommendations that we're going to provide FDACs in May of 2024. And just protection strategies. I just want to advocate for, if you don't know about Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, you may know it got a lot of funding last year. It was zero funded this year because of a veto by the governor. This is a really important program. I believe, this is my opinion, that each program, Florida Forever and Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, should both get $250 million a year. The need is there. If you add up all the worth of the land in the Florida Wildlife Corridor that hasn't been protected, it's going to take a multi-decadal commitment to protect all of that land. So that's really important. We need to get as many federal conservation dollars as we can in the state of Florida, because even Florida Forever and Rural and Family Lands is not enough. We want to develop payments for ecosystem services. One of the things you should tell your legislators is, hey, you have this Florida Wildlife Corridor law. It says all this nice stuff about payments for ecosystem services and similar programs. But why haven't you passed a law in the last 2 years that actually provides a workable ecosystem services payment program? You say it's an important way to protect the corridor. Where's the beef, right? How do we actually do that? Can we have a workable program? And other things like lease and habitat management programs short of an in perpetuity agreement. There's lots of landowners who aren't ready to sign on to an easement in perpetuity. There are other ways to protect land to provide ecosystem service benefits short of an easement. And we also want to make sure that we emphasize good development planning. They go hand in hand. We don't want to stop development. We just want to make sure it has as little impact on areas that are important for providing ecosystem services and provides agricultural security for the state as well. Thank you.
Ernie, you can go ahead and take it away if you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me, Brittany?
We can.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of your program today. I was really hoping to be with you in person, but obviously Mother Nature threw a wrench into that plan, and I hope everyone is safe and moving towards recovery, whatever that might be, depending upon what situation you're in. And I think it's quite telling that the reason why we're going to be talking about Florida climate smart agriculture is because the climate is changing, and we don't even need to debate why it's changing, but it is changing. And Hurricane Idalia, I think, is a classic example of a 21st century dimension of climate change, where we are experiencing larger, more intense, and rapidly developing major storms that are disrupting what used to be a pretty predictable production platform for U.S. agriculture and Florida agriculture. And that's why, one of the reasons why we launched Florida Climate Smart Agriculture. So if I can, there we go. So what is Florida Climate Smart Agriculture? It is a multi-stakeholder initiative led by farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, and Lynetta Usher-Greiner, who I'll mention in a minute, has been a pivotal leader in this whole initiative since the beginning. But it is a collaborative where we are coming together to explore the future of Florida agriculture. What does it look like? How can we remain relevant and viable into the 21st century, given some of the changes that Tom just talked about that are coming? And what we've been focusing on pretty extensively is this concept of ecosystem services. So this, I said, it's farmer, rancher, forester led. You all know Lynetta, I'm sure. Jim Strickland may be well known to some of you as well. Jim's a rancher. Lynetta is a forest landowner and a rancher. And together, they have pulled together a group of over 30 of their peers that are working together to take an honest assessment of the current state of Florida agriculture and then look at what we could do going forward. There are all kinds of global challenges, and this is context for us because Florida is not an island unto itself. And many of the global challenges, like rapidly rising populations, the loss of productive farms, forest lands, and forest lands, these increasingly severe weather events that I talked about, are all combining to create major challenges for the future of forestry, for the future of agriculture as we know it today. So what we're looking at is how can we pivot? How can we adapt? And in doing so, remain relevant going forward. One of the lenses that we're looking through are the global UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the United Nations, which is composed of 197, I think, countries around the world, forged consensus back in 2015 on a set of 17 mega goals. You probably have heard about at least some of these. These are commitments that the world's countries have said they're going to work towards and achieve them by 2030. Well, the reality is things like ending hunger, solving the climate crisis, improving quality of life around the world. All of these are massive goals, and none of them can be achieved unless agriculture is contributing solutions. So if agriculture is successful, we can be valued and recognized and compensated through market mechanisms that will create a new definition of Florida agriculture, of U.S. agriculture, where we're not just producing commodities, but we're simultaneously filtering and storing water. We're providing improvements in biodiversity. We're creating wildlife habitat. We're sequestering carbon. And these are all the building blocks of ecosystem services. So this has become the central area of focus for Florida Climate Smart Agriculture, because our leaders have said we can't just be seen and stuck in the 20th century as producers of wonderful commodities. And there are many, many in Florida, whether it's timber or strawberries or citrus or cattle. Those are all obviously part of what agriculture will be. But the new definition of Florida agriculture that we're working on is one where we'll produce commodities, but we'll concurrently deliver these ecosystem services. And we're not going to do it for free. And this is the heart of this work. We are looking at ways to create payment mechanisms. So if you were a timber landowner, you would be compensated in the marketplace, not just for the timber that you're producing, but all of those other ecosystem services that come along with it, whether it's water storage, carbon storage, biodiversity, wildlife habitat. And this is the focus of our work. Back up here. The ecosystem services term is kind of a wonky term, but if you really stop and think about it and think about what farms and forests and rangelands do, they deliver a lot of things that we know because we own the land, we work the land, but the public takes for granted and just assumes they're going to be provided for oftentimes nothing. So we've been looking at all the types of ecosystem services and then thinking about what we can do to create market mechanisms to ensure that the work that we're doing, the solutions we're delivering, are valued properly and we're compensated. So we have two work streams in our ecosystem services bucket. The first is working through the University of Florida IFAS in an effort to quantify and measure these services, because what we're talking about is a market evolving, and there will be buyers and sellers. We're the sellers, we're the providers of these services. The buyers are looking for confidence that we actually are delivering what they're buying. So if you take soil carbon sequestration, which has been talked about a lot in the news over the last 4 or 5 years, the emitters, the polluting entities that have high carbon emissions are looking to offset their emissions through purchasing solutions that forest landowners and producers can deliver. That's an offset market. And there may be other types of opportunities to develop beyond just offset markets. But there has to be a transaction. If you're dealing with a buyer, or if you're dealing with a government easement program, they're looking for confidence that what we're doing is actually delivering results. So our first area of work here is trying to monitor, measure, and verify these outcomes. And we're using artificial intelligence, we're using modeling, we're using satellite imagery. There's a whole variety of tools that are coming together and being led by the University of Florida's researchers to see if we can come up with an easier, simpler way to quantify and verify these outcomes. The second component of work that we're focused on is building a simple market mechanism that will actually be productive and work for farmers and foresters and ranchers. The current early generation markets have been very complicated, and so much of the cost and time and energy has been concentrated on quantifying and verifying that every commitment that we're making as sellers are there. And they're erring on the side of over demonstrating results that are resulting in most of the costs going not into rewarding the producer for the services they're providing, but into the folks in the middle that measure and monitor and verify. So we're looking at this from a landowner's perspective. How can we develop a market that is fair and effective and balanced, but doesn't consume a disproportionate amount of the resources just through the verification process? Tom just led us through a discussion of land use changes and trends, and we are very cognizant of this because as we're thinking about the future of Florida agriculture and forestry, we're mindful of the fact that the climate is changing, that sea level rise is occurring, saltwater intrusion is occurring. but so too is population increases and shifts. And I think one of the most powerful drivers of our work and our commitment in this space is the reality that close to 1,000 people a day are moving into the state of Florida. These people want a home. They want a place that they can put down roots. And that often involves migrating out, the sprawl type development that Tom talked about. And obviously that is a very disruptive land use change for forestry, for agriculture. So if these trends continue, there's going to be tremendous pressure on Florida's farmlands, ranchlands, woodlands, and it's going to be very, very difficult to push this tide back. So if we can demonstrate that as land managers, we're improving quality of life, we are filtering and storing water, we are maintaining these open spaces for wildlife, we are delivering across those 17 sustainable development goals, probably 9 or 10 solution pathways. We think that's going to be a way to revalue agriculture and ensure that it remains a preferred land use as decisions are made about the future of Florida. So we are well along in this journey. We are producing a roadmap and an action plan to take us from the 20th century to the 21st century. And it's one where working lands will be much higher prioritized, where the men and women and the families that own and manage these lands are going to be seen not just as commodity producers, but of quality of life producers. So I would welcome an opportunity here to respond to any questions if we can get to that. But you're so fortunate that you have Lynetta Usher-Greiner in the seat as co-chair of this entire initiative. And she and Jim are very passionate about this. And my organization, Solutions to the Land, the University of Florida, IFAS, are the co-sponsors of this work. But I can absolutely guarantee you, this is not a top-down discussion and exercise. This is bottom-up. We have simply created a platform for these leaders to come together and explore their future and develop a roadmap that they'll be taking to policymakers, value chain partners, academic partners, and others to create a better future. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And I'll stand by and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Ernie. Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody? Oh, Jimmy has one. Jimmy, you might have to come up here.
Year 2070, according to one of the illustrations, the majority of the state will be either in maybe a conservation easement or development. Where will the food source come from? Will we become an importer of our fresh vegetables and canned goods and that sort of thing? Because, you know, we're having to grow more on less already.
Maybe I could take a crack at that, Tom.
Yep.
I think that's exactly why we're looking at this future of working lands producing food still, but concurrently producing ecosystem services. So if one of the tools in our toolbox is easement programs to protect farmland and forest land, that will be a way for those lands to continue to work and produce food, fiber, fuel, whatever it is that is grown or raised. So it's a both and, it's not an either or, but we're convinced that if we're not demonstrating the value of these working lands and we can't secure the resources through easements and other ways to permanently protect land, that tsunami of red ink is going to just swarm across the state and push us further and further into fragmented islands of productivity that no longer represent a landscape scale ability to produce food at scale. So I think we share your concern, and that's why we're trying to knit together multiple tools to keep these working lands working. Tom, maybe you've got another perspective.
Ernie, I'm just going to add a little bit of detail to what you already said. It's important to understand that easements come in all different types. And some easements, and I'll provide one specific example here in a second, provide for continuing. In fact, most easements do either existing agricultural operations, ranch, timber, or other. And then there are other types of easements that are called agricultural easements that allow for potential conversion from current crop type to future crop types. And the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, if you don't know about that program, you should look into it, because that is the program that got most of the land conservation, land protection conservation dollars last year. In Florida Forever, which most of you know about, got less. Florida Forever is a traditional easement program. So some of the land, yes, is bought fee simple, meaning it turns into a state park or state forest. But even Florida Forever has been emphasizing easements more and more. Those are traditional conservation easements in the sense that typically those easements are on working lands. Like if it's a timber operation, Florida Forever does not typically restrict your operations. It may be that you negotiate best management practices or something of that nature, but existing agricultural operations are included in the easement as things that will continue in perpetuity. What it usually restricts, though, is you switching from a current agricultural operation to something else that isn't currently on the property. RFLPP, the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, are true agricultural easements. Unless a property is, land on the property is designated a special natural area, it is, and it's not a wetland. If it's upland, if it's currently ranch, it could be converted to a crop at some point. If it's timberland, it could be potentially converted to some other type of crop. So you should know, if you didn't know that already, that there is a lot of potential for land to be protected as an easement and still providing agricultural commodities. In fact, that is one of the goals. And what is probably true by 2070, I hope it's not true, or 2100, that most of the land that is in production may very well be protected from development by an easement that's in place. I don't know if we'll be there at that point yet. I'm hoping we're not. But that's the trend.
All right, so I'm thinking about management of the easements at this point, because we've got a few thousand acres of our timberland that's in conservation easement, and we retain the timber rights, and we retain the rights, even though we don't currently run cattle on it, to allow someone to put cattle on it and a small amount of it to be converted. But part of managing timberland, and I must say also our state-owned lands, okay? And then let's be clear, when an easement is sold to the state, we're in Florida Forever, and we're going to be in rural and family lands if the current application goes through for that one. That's actually a property right that the people of the state, that everybody in this room owns a little piece of on our property along with us. Well, if those lands are not managed, both public and private, and in the north part of the state, and I'm not very familiar with the cattle ranches on the south part of the state, if they're not managed with prescribed fire, then you are not in any way, manner, shape, or form going to be fulfilling the purposes for which those dollars were spent and that land is there. So part of this has to be that, you know, this is all fine and dandy. We can all buy this land and then we can let it become California, because we don't change the regulatory world such that the people that live here understand that they should complain when they don't smell smoke in the spring rather than when they do smell smoke. And another part of it is too, that if we can manage the land with prescribed fire, then we don't need to use so many herbicides. And so, you know, this, again, all the rest of it aside, a bigger focus on some of the ongoing management and in addressing and at the federal level, and we discussed this at the Prescribed Fire Working Group day before yesterday for a few minutes, is the federal wanting to knock down the particulate rule and make it more difficult. Y'all, there's a lot more to address than just what you're addressing here, but what I'm speaking of is part of this if we're going to do this. So.
I think that's a tremendously important point. And we're not talking about preservation programs where we're acquiring, locking up, and walking away. We use the word working and very deliberately, that these lands will continue to work. And part of it is education. If the public wants the outcomes that the world leaders have established, that most folks think are important outcomes, you cannot do it unless you have an opportunity to manage these landscapes according to their needs to produce the outcomes they want. So looking at it narrowly, just around one dimension of a potential problem and ignoring the wider range of solutions that come out is something we have to be on guard against. And I think the more we can do to demonstrate that these working lands are capable of producing all kinds of outcomes, and that to do that, we need managers on the land operating with, I wouldn't say no restrictions, but with common sense guidance and programs and incentives so that they're delivering the outcomes that the public wants. So good point.
Thank you. We have time for, well, so Lamar, come on up. And then did somebody have a question over here? Perfect. Okay. One more question and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
This is probably more of a small scale thing, but starting to see a lot of solar farms pop up in North Florida and South Georgia, and they're popping up on good ag land and timberland. Is anybody doing anything to address that or look at, see if that's going to have some kind of impact? Because it's kind of working for the same goal that y'all are talking about, but it can be a conflict.
Yes, and Florida Climate Smart Agriculture didn't have time to talk about it this morning. One of our other work streams is a clean energy work stream. And we're looking at it from the standpoint of what can we do to deliver the renewable forms of energy that we're increasingly migrating to. But what we're up against in Florida is a set of rules and regulations that bias and favor large industrial scale utilities that put massive size scale solar arrays up as an example. And those can be very disruptive. That's another form of land fragmentation. So the footprint is already there for many of these large industrial scale sub farms, but the utilities are planning even more. So we are working with partners across the state to rebalance the rules so that it's not all about large industrial scale. So there could be a way for a farmer or forest landowner, a cluster, a community to come together and design a system that works for them. So in a agricultural operation, if you have an irrigated farm set up, there may be portions of your fields that you could deploy solar as a clean energy value-added solution that you're providing, or rooftop solar. But right now we don't have that ability to do that because the rules don't allow for smaller distributed generation systems. So we're working hard in that space as well. And we're certainly very cognizant of this fragmentation challenge coming from the utility landscape, large landscape solar projects. So thanks for bringing that up.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen. We really appreciate all this information. And yeah, let's give them a round of applause. Tom, thank you for making the trip. And Ernie, thank you for joining us virtually. And it sounds like a lot of you guys are interested in this topic. So if you at all want to get in contact with either of them, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you guys. So we are going to move on to our next presenter. Ernie, you're welcome. Yep, he went. So I'll get the presentation up in a minute while Dr. Joe Conrad comes on up. But our next speaker is Dr. Joe Conrad. He's Associate Professor of the Forest Operations and Harley Langdale Junior Center for Forest Business at the University of Georgia. He teaches classes on topics such as timber harvesting and field measurements. He also conducts research on timber transportation safety and efficiencies, timber harvesting productivity and cost, logging capacity, and wood supply chain efficiency. His recent research has focused on measuring timber transportation cost and reducing log truck crashes. Joe is here to talk about immediate challenges to the logging business success and the long-term obstacles to the formation and retention of logging businesses. So I'm excited to hear this one. This is a huge topic we all deal with and have been dealing with for many years. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Welcome.
All right, thanks a lot, Brittany, and really appreciate the invitation to speak with